You're on Strat News Global. I'm Nitin Gokhale. Today, in our series on China and its economy and the current state of affairs, I have with me Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretary and, of course, China watcher, China specialist, also India's ambassador to China during the Doklam or Dolam crisis in between 2017. I mean, in 2017, and of course, later became Foreign Secretary. Vijay, welcome to this program, and I think it's a occasion to look at what's happening in China at a time when Donald Trump is assuming office in US. Well, let me start with asking you about your book, which you had written post Tiananmen, how China sort of got its act together, and then very focused way got its economy going. You sort of focused on that. First, tell us what that was. How did China do it? And as a follow-up, tell us whether you think that China is still continuing on that path, or it's now got some very heavy speed breakers on the way.
Yeah, thank you, Nitin, for having me on your show. And I'm glad that we are talking of the Chinese economy because most often we either talk of the Chinese military or the Chinese political scene. But I think the economy is going to be the crux of China's future going forward. Let me begin by saying that the spectacular economic progress China made between 1990 and 2010 was because they took very significant political risks in doing economic reform in the 1980s and early 1990s. Both Deng Xiaoping and his successors, Jiang, Zemin, and Jintao, took these risks of doing the reform despite certain economic challenges that they faced. And these reforms essentially were of two kinds. The first was a significant decentralization of power. Power flowed out from Beijing to the provinces and from the provinces to the counties, and it incentivized provincial governments to stimulate the economic activity, and it incentivized the large state owned corporations to start making decisions on the basis of the market rather than the party. And this is what led to very substantial economic growth. The second major trigger was that there was a relative relaxation of societal controls, which led to an explosion of education, of ideas, and of innovation. And it really energized the nascent private sector, which by 2020 had become a very significant part of the Chinese economy. So essentially, decentralization and relaxation of societal controls led to this enormous upsurge of the Chinese economy. Now, one of my contentions is that under the current leader, President Xi Jinping, there is a reversal on both fronts. Some of this is understandable because along with that economic growth came vast corruption and also a weakening of the party's control. And Xi Jinping has tried to reimpose that by also reining in the economy. But not all of it can be explained by this. I think there is also a deeper sense that the party is losing control, and what we are therefore seeing is a securitization of the economy. Now, effectively, what this means is decision making in provincial governments and by heads of state owned enterprises are constrained. They do not want to experiment anymore because it is simpler to, as the Chinese saying goes, lying flat rather than taking a risk which might land you in prison. The other impact is that when you curtail societal freedoms and you start imposing controls right down to the village and working unit levels, you also curtail entrepreneurship. And businesses as well as individuals are not motivated to produce ideas or to innovate or to implement those ideas. Now, how this will impact on economic growth going forward is still to be seen. But there is no doubt that it is already having an impact. And in a sense, it is a reversal of the reforms that Deng Xiaoping has done.
I see. So, one of the things that people say that post-COVID, the Chinese economy has certainly slowed down, and there were, of course, there was a power struggle. Of course, Xi Jinping has managed to hold on, and not only hold on, tighten his grip both over the party and the government. But are there structural problems within the Chinese economy? Because for too long, if you take the example of what happened between 1990s and 2020, the liberalization can be seen by supporters of Xi Jinping as giving too much liberty to private sector, whatever nascent or later developed private sector, and therefore they tighten the controls. But that has resulted in structural problems. What's your view on that?
Yeah, so I think one fact is now indisputable. That is the double digit growth that China enjoyed until 2015 or 16 is over and will never return. It will have to be lower growth, albeit on a base of $18 trillion. But there are three structural problems which are of greater concern. The first is obvious: excess industrial capacity and inventory. From steel to robotics to lithium ion batteries to solar photovoltaic cells, China is overproducing. And the world cannot absorb what they are producing. Secondly, of course, you have low domestic consumption because the population for 30 years was told that goods had to be exported rather than domestically consumed. And the third problem is a slowdown in infrastructure and a housing market crash. Now, very briefly, to just go into each of these, because all of them have consequences for the economy. One, of course, is overcapacity. Now, overcapacity to some extent can be balanced by additional exports, and that is, of course, happening. But as of now, there is increasingly a global backlash in some of the major countries to what they consider to be dumping of Chinese goods in their markets. And this backlash is surprisingly not just coming from the West. Recently, Turkey, Brazil, Indonesia, and of course India have imposed some form of tariffs on certain Chinese goods, which is going to slow down that export. So, in other words, they can't export their way out of the crisis. Now, the obvious case then is to increase consumption domestically. But the problem with that is, again, you have a structural problem because you are asking them to consume at a time when the economy is slowing and therefore there is falling optimism in the population. You then have the anxiety caused by a demographic collapse. In other
Right.
words, who is going to look after me when I retire? Because the working population is going to be much smaller and social welfare measures are not in place. And thirdly, savings have been significantly eroded because most Chinese have savings in the housing market. And when
Right.
the housing prices have crashed, the savings have fallen. So, what is happening in fact is that the Chinese are cutting back on spending precisely
Mm.
at a time when the leadership wants them to spend more.
Right.
And this is really a major problem for them. The third obvious way in which they earlier used to pump prime the economy was then to spend on infrastructure.
Right.
But the problem with that now is that there are significant parts of China where there is no possibility of building additional infrastructure, where return on capital is extremely poor if you do so, and also the housing crash has resulted in a fall in the state revenues on land use right sales, and therefore the state also has less money to invest in pump priming. Now, I'm not saying that it is a continuous picture of doom and gloom because we both know that there are some highlights and bright lights of the Chinese economy. Certainly, in new technology, China is a leading power in many, many new technologies. But the
True.
problem with new technologies is there is low employment potential. And if you cannot export them because of sanctions or tariffs or because other countries do not want it for security reasons, and there is a trust deficit in the West, then you are not going to generate the sort of GDP that you can generate, which is going to keep that population satisfied economically. So, yes, I would say there are structural problems that China has to deal with. Xi Jinping is trying, but let's see if he succeeds.
Also, additionally, I mean, all points very valid and very significant. BRI has not really lived up to its potential or promise, and therefore, all the excess capacity which would have been deployed and which would have been used overseas has probably also not got deployed the way probably the Chinese had planned.
Correct, because the BRI model is essentially based on giving Chinese financing to foreign governments for the purchase of Chinese goods and services. And two reasons for the decline in that after COVID. One is that as China's growth slows down, its capacity to lend is not as generous as it was earlier. But secondly, the borrowing states in most cases or in many cases are unable to pay back the interest in time and in some cases have defaulted. So there is a tendency then by China's policy banks not to lend more money to those defaulting economies, but that in turn means that China cannot sell its goods and services abroad under the Belt and Road Initiative in the way that it could before 2019. So in a sense, it's a catch-22 situation for the Chinese, and it's not helping the Chinese economy.
Yeah, absolutely. But this China is full of contradictions, and so you will know it better than anybody else. We just read reports a couple of days ago that they have now posted nearly $1 billion of trade surplus. What explains that? And secondly, just as a subset of that question, what would Xi Jinping do in this situation? Because likely trade war with China, with US, is looming. All this slowing down of economy is happening. What are his steps for solutions?
Yes, so as you said, they have a $1 trillion surplus in the year 2023, which is very impressive, but should not come as a surprise because according to various studies, one third of all manufacturing goods in the world are now made in China. The problem with having such a high trade surplus is that it actually gives a higher profile abroad and it leads to trade defense measures by other countries and a backlash in all markets. And because Belt and Road Initiative is also not capable of absorbing the excess capacity, what is going to eventually happen is that to sell that excess capacity, China is going to engage in a price war in the international markets. And this is precisely what Donald Trump is out to stop.
Yeah.
He and the Europeans are out to stop this price war and this price cutting, which China perhaps is compelled to do. Because if it does not export those products, at home, on the home front, it faces economic losses and job losses, and therefore potential social instability. So, in effect, perhaps the most interesting phase in the next 10 to 12 months is going to be the dynamic between the new president of the United States and the president of China on how they are going to deal with this problem of the trade surplus. Nonetheless, we should also be careful in recording the fact that many countries of the world, including ours, are dependent on Chinese products. And therefore, China will continue to maintain a healthy trade surplus for the years ahead. And that, in a sense, is a great benefit to it. But I think if the expectation on the Chinese side is that they can go on increasing the trade surplus as a substitute for the poor domestic consumption, I think that's a presumption they should not proceed on. And I think that in some way that is no solution in the long term to the structural problems.
True. I need to take a break here. When we come back, we will discuss India's approach. What should be India's approach towards China's economy or its trade deficit that India has, and of course, what going forward, what we should look for when the dynamic between the new administration in the United States and China dominates the discourse as well as trade practices. But don't go away. I'm in conversation with Vijay Gokhale. Welcome back. I am discussing the Chinese economy with former Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale. And in the context of what's happening at the current moment, where China has posted $1 trillion of trade surplus, but that is something India is aware of, because the trade deficit with China, India has one of the highest as far as India is concerned. But in the list of trade deficits with other countries, perhaps India comes much lower. So, how should India deal with Chinese, practices, trade, and the dependence in many cases that India has on Chinese goods and Chinese raw materials, Vijay?
Yeah. So, I think we first have to look at the statistics, Nitin. What is significant is that between 2019 and 2023, or the fiscal years 2019-20 to 2023-24, India's exports to China were more or less stagnant at 16 to 18 billion dollars. But China's exports to India doubled almost from about 60 billion dollars to well over 100 billion dollars. So, what we are looking at is a massive trade deficit of $103 billion this year, which is still growing. Now, people tend to focus only on the percentage of our trade with China as an overall percentage of that trade, and that is very small because China's total trade volume is $6 trillion and the India China volume is only $140 billion, which means we roughly account for 2% of trade. But what we should really be focusing on is the percentage of the deficit we have with China as a percentage of its overall trade surplus. If you look at that, then the trade deficit of $103 billion is 11% of the Chinese trade surplus of $1 trillion. In other words, for every $10 that China has a trade surplus, India contributes a full $1 to it. And that is a very, very significant number, which we must look at. It is not sustainable, and this is not a commercial issue, it is a political issue. And we must anticipate that the situation will worsen because while exports have grown, Chinese exports to India have grown, imports are constantly slowing down, not just with India but globally, because of the Make in China campaign that President Xi has launched. And therefore, a reset of the trade terms becomes difficult. Now, the problem becomes even more complex because key industries on the Indian side, take textiles for instance, machinery, pharmaceuticals, organic chemicals, electronics, auto components, all of them are dependent in some form or another on Chinese intermediate products or machinery or finished goods or active pharmaceutical ingredients and so on and so forth. So you cannot also drastically crack down on exports there because it will affect your top export performing sectors of the Indian economy. You also have the problem of the price wars that China is engaging in certain sectors like the pharma sector in an effort to hollow out the Indian economy. So you have a problem there as well. And then China is not making any progress in reducing non-tariff barriers, although it repeatedly promises to do so in things like government procurement of IT-enabled services, which is a big Indian export, or phytosanitary restrictions on the export of grains, food, and fruit and vegetables, or regulatory hurdles for, let us say, registering pharmaceutical products and drugs. Now, when all this is combined, it provides a significant challenge for the government because what government has to do is then to pivot away without seriously damaging our own economy. And what is required, in my opinion, is a systematic government support to industry, which is industry specific. You can't target every single industry in the economy. Number two, it has to be policy based. It cannot be a one off event. And thirdly, it has to be financially sustainable. If you want companies to buy to go to alternative sources where the same
Sources.
equipment is available, and that might cost 1.5 to 2 times what China is offering because China is engaging in price wars, government has to find some way of supporting our industry so that the pain is not borne by Indian business alone, but also by the government. So I would say We are facing a formidable challenge, but it is necessary for Indians to recognize how much we are contributing to China's trade surplus. That must be the starting point from which a political consensus and a consensus with business must be built to make a fundamental pivot away from the Chinese economy.
Absolutely. I think it's a catch-22 for the government. If they crack down too hard, then the industry suffers, like you mentioned, and the economy has a setback. Some of the some products like Apple is now producing from India. There are some efforts to sort of move away from Chinese supply lines to what they call resilient supply chains. But that has not really worked, except for some bans that India put on some of the apps, and
Yeah.
some non-tariff barriers they've been put in on some of the security sensitive sectors like telecom and electricity, all that. So, like Apple recently complained that they are not allowing some of the parts to come to India. Even the experts are not being sort of allowed to come. That may be India's fault, of course, or India is being choosy or selective. So, what is the way out then? Because people have to understand that our dependence on China has grown so ridiculously high over the past quarter century or maybe 20 years that it's not easy to sort of go away from that in say 2 or 3 or 4 years. It has to be a long haul.
In my view, the informal sanctions that China is gradually placing on Indian industry is a greater concern than the trade deficit. In a sense,
That's right.
sometimes it is easier to solve a trade deficit than to solve what China is doing. And in the last 6 months, bits and pieces of news have been gradually leaking out of Indian industry about how China is trying to strangle certain sectors. We know the case where tunnel boring machines for large infrastructure projects are being denied. We have also heard recently that there have been some restrictions placed on ship to shore cranes, on oil rigs, on large dredging machines for ports. And most recently, there are rumors that has instructed its own companies not to transfer technology on lithium ion batteries to India. And on the heels of this now comes an admission by Foxconn, the original equipment manufacturer for Apple, that China is preventing certain sophisticated machines for the next generation of Apple phones to be exported to India. I don't know how much more information you need to understand that this is now a systematic application of industrial sanctions to strangle India's growth by the Chinese government. But industry still seems to be hesitant in voicing its apprehensions. And
Hmm.
in that situation, China's propaganda or disinformation focuses precisely on the points you mentioned. They will point to the fact that India has denied investment clearance to one particular investment, or that India is denying visas to professionals and businessmen. And this is to deflect attention from these sanctions, from the greater structural problem that we have. So, what we really require, Nitin, is an industry wide study that must be taken on a war footing by CII and FICCI both, as well as other chambers of commerce, on which industries have begun to face these problems. Because
Hmm.
until we know how widespread these problems are, we are never really going to be able to determine policy.
True.
So, this is a huge problem and we need to deal with it.
I think we've not paid enough attention to it, and thank you for sort of drawing attention to it through this conversation. It's war by other means, actually. I mean, we may have peace on the border or a fragile peace on the border, but this is a longer and a more damaging war, I would say, the way you have pointed it out. So I think government has a lot to think about, a lot of food for thought in this conversation. Thank you very much, Vijay, for joining me on this broadcast. We will come back to you with more such discussions in the future. But for the timing, it's very much something that we should worry about and discuss in various forums that the government must take a look at. I'll see you on the other side some other time. But for the moment, thank you.
Thank you, Nitin.
So keep watching Strat News Global. You know to where to reach us. Our social media handles are visible to you. Your feedback is always welcome, and we will bring to you such series, interesting topics on the Chinese economy, maybe even the US-Russia war that might, or tension that might erupt in coming days or coming years. We'll have to see all that. But for the moment, it's goodbye from me.